The story of the white snake. This is quite an odd one um, in the Grimm brothers' folk tales. There was once a king who seemed to have a huge amount of knowledge. He seemed to know things that were going on anywhere in the world, and nobody really understood how it was that he gained this knowledge. He had one strange custom. After he'd finished eating, a separate dish was brought in, and he always ate this dish alone, making sure that there was no one else in the room. And the dish was brought in, and it was covered, and it was always brought in by the same trusted servant. And the servant, after some time, as you would, grew curious as to what it was that was inside this dish that no one else was allowed to see. So one day the servant took the lid off the dish, and to his surprise, what was on the plate was a white snake. And looking at it, the servant had an overwhelming urge to eat a little piece of the snake. So he broke a piece off and took a bite. And he found that he could hear strange voices through the window, and realised that there were sparrows on the window ledge, and he could hear every word that they were saying. They were talking about what they had been doing. They had been talking about the things that were going on. Now, later that day, the Queen said that she had lost her favourite ring, and the faithful servant was blamed for this. And the Queen said that it must have been him who stole it, because he was the only person who had access to everything. So it was declared that the servant would be executed the next morning for the theft of the ring. But as it wasn't possible for him to escape from the palace grounds, he found himself wandering around the gardens and found himself listening to the conversation between the ducks. And the ducks swimming around in the pond were talking to each other about what they had had to eat and what a great day they had had. But there was one duck said, "I have a terrible ache in my belly. I was eating so fast today that I accidentally swallowed a ring that was outside the Queen's bedroom window." So the servant, quick as a flash, grabbed the duck by the neck and took it into the kitchen and said to the cook, "This duck is ripe for killing, this duck is ripe for roasting." And the cook looked at the duck and said, "You're not wrong, that's a good fat healthy duck." So when the duck was gutted and the ring was found in its stomach, of course the servant could prove his innocence. And the king, who felt a little guilty about the way he had treated the faithful servant after his years of fine service, asked what he could do to make amends. And the servant said, "I have a great yearning to travel. I have a great yearning to go out into the world." So the king agreed, and he gave the servant a horse from the stable and released him from his service. And so the servant set out into the world on a fine horse. And after a few days he came to a river, and there, stuck in the reeds, were 3 fish. And the 3 fish were wailing because they couldn't return to the water. So the servant climbed down from his horse and gently freed the fish from the reeds and sent them back into the waters of the river. And the fish said, "Thank you, kind sir. We will remember your kindness, and one day we will repay you." And later that day, as the servant was riding along, he heard beneath his horse's feet, "Oh, these clumsy humans! Look at them! Look at that horse! It's clambering! It's squashing all my people!" But what the servant could hear was the voice of the king ant. So he moved his horse over a little, so that the horse was no longer treading on the ants who were scurrying around on the road. And the king of the ants looked up and said, "Thank you. One day I will repay you for your kindness." And the servant carried on, and he rode through some woods. And he heard from a nest above him a mother raven and a father raven. And they were saying to their children, you must leave the nest. We can't feed you any more. You're nothing but freeloaders. It's time you went off into the world and found your own way." But the ravens said, we're only children. We don't know how to hunt. What are we to do?" But without pity and without remorse, the mother and the father ravens simply threw the chicks out of the nest. So the servant, who felt very sorry for the small birds, took a sword and killed his own horse. And so the ravens were able to feed themselves from the flesh. So the servant carried on walking by now until he reached a city built of fine stone. And there a man was riding through the streets saying, "Whoever can complete a task can marry the princess." And the servant thought he would try his luck at this, for he no longer had a horse and he had little to lose. So he presented himself to the king as a suitor for the king's daughter. The young man was taken down to the sea, and there the king threw a ring into the water and said, "Dive down and fetch the ring. If you come up for air, we will push you down again and keep pushing you down until you drown or until you find the ring." So the young man thought, what am I to do? It's impossible for anyone to find a ring that has been thrown into the sea. And as he was standing on the beach, contemplating his fate, 3 fish swam up, and the middle fish presented him with a shell, and inside the shell was the ring that the king had thrown into the sea. And of course you know and I know that these were the 3 fish that the young man had rescued. But the princess was a haughty type and didn't really want to marry at all. So she went out into the garden with 3 bags of millet and emptied them all out onto the grass and said to the young man, "Your second task is to pick up every single grain of millet. And if there is so much as 1 grain left by the morning, your life will be forfeit." So the poor servant looked at the pile, looked at the millet that was spread around in the grass and thought, it's not possible. But as the sun began to rise, to his surprise and amazement, every single grain of millet had been carefully placed inside a sack. And of course, it was the ants that the young man had saved earlier in the story had come in his hour of need and had saved his life by placing all the millet in the sacks. So when the princess came down to the garden and saw the sacks full of millet, the servant thought that she would be overjoyed and thought that they would marry. But the princess still had one more task left for him. She said, "Before I marry you, I wish to have an apple from the tree of life." Now the poor young man didn't know where the tree of life was, and didn't know how to get the apple, but he set off on foot and he walked for many, many days until he came to a wood. And overcome with weariness, he sat down at the base of a tree, wondering what on earth he was to do, being alone and cold and hungry. And 3 ravens flew down and appeared to him, and from the tree, or from out of the air, dropped the most beautiful golden apple he had ever seen. And the ravens said, "We are the ravens whose life you saved. And when we heard what had happened to you, we flew to the end of the world where the tree of life grows. And we picked an apple from the tree of life." So the young servant walked back to the stone city and presented himself to the palace with the apple from the tree of life. And by now, the princess had run out of tasks, and she'd lost her haughtiness. And she was really quite impressed by this handsome young man. So they cut the apple in half, and they ate half each. And as she swallowed the last of the apple, the princess found herself filled with love for this strange young man. So they did marry, and they did live. Go on, you can do this bit. You know the last words. They really did live happily ever after. As I hope shall all of you. It's an odd one, that, because there's certain echoes of stories from Norse mythology. Fafnir, no, Sigurd eats the heart of Fafnir after Fafnir has been turned into a great serpent or possibly a dragon, and after that he can understand the speech of birds. There we are. Maybe it's a good skill. If ever you learn how to do this, do let me know what the trick of it is.